5.
Not only are we in deep doo-doo, co-pilot, things can only get shittier.
4.
To raise taxes to fix the public finances is economically inept.
3.
They'll be biting their tongues before they criticise the government in future, and that must be part of the government's intention.
2.
It's not performative spending cuts that will fix the public finances. It is growth, growth, growth.
1. We have liftoff.
Welcome to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Allison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. Good to have you back, co-pilot, sunkissed and fighting fit. And it's good you are back, because in your absence, the UK itself seems to have gone back to the 70s. This Labour government is not yet 2 months old, and yet we've already seen inflation-busting pay deals handed to a raft of trade unions. And over the dog days of summer, incoming ministers have been preparing the ground for a raft of what I'd say are pretty ideologically driven tax changes, ahead of the autumn budget statement on October the 30th. Since you last climbed aboard the rocket, Allison, we've seen riots across many UK cities following the horrific killing of 3 small girls at a Taylor Swift-themed dance class in Southport, as I discussed last week with Planet Normal Cosmonaut Supreme Baroness Claire Fox. The Tories' somewhat low-key leadership contest is getting into gear, a contest not due to produce a result until early November, after that crucial October 30th budget. Surely that date needs to come forward. For the good of democracy, the UK needs at least some kind of opposition party, and fast. Labour says there's a £22 billion black hole in the public finances, which they didn't know about before the election. Even the Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies says that the funding gap was, and I quote exactly, obvious to anyone who dared look. Yet ministers keep repeating the Tories hid this claim, saying that's why they're now being forced to raise taxes and impose other painful measures like cutting the winter fuel allowance, which they failed to mention before the country voted. And people wonder why the punters don't trust politicians. Within a fortnight of the 4th of July election, Allison, you and I were warning that Keir Starmer's honeymoon would be short, despite Labour's crushing election win. A lot less crushing if you drill down into the electoral fine print. We were derided for saying as much, weren't we? But now, just a month on, the Labour leader's approval rating, according to opinion polls, has plunged to minus 16, 27 points down from the post-election high. So much to discuss, dear Allison, but firstly, how does it feel to be back? And what did you think of Starmer's speech earlier this week from the Downing Street Rose Garden?
Well, I go off to get my blood pressure lowered. And what happens in my absence? By the way, I really enjoyed last week's podcast with obviously the always wonderful Claire Fox and John Moynihan. If only he could be the Chancellor of the Exchequer talking sense about growth. This will make you laugh. While I was on holiday, I texted a friend who's recently taken over a school in Switzerland, having read that day's Daily Telegraph with all its, riots and all the misgendering people at the Paris Olympics. And I said, is there any chance I could come and be your head of English? Just, And he replied and he said, you piqued my interest as to what it was in the Telegraph that had made you want to leave the country. And he said he read the first 7 headlines and could see perfectly well why any sane person might want to get out of Blighty. I feel very strongly about this, Liam. I think I felt that a Starmer government would probably be incompetent, high taxing, rocket boosters on all the wokery, doling out favours to their various client group, shafting the hard-working private sector. But I have to say, I didn't anticipate it would be frightening. And I do feel that what we've seen when I was away and after the riots following that massacre in Southport, which the authorities have done their best to play down, but 3 little girls, Bibi, Elsie and Alice, were slaughtered at a Taylor Swift dance class. And I'm sure we'll be talking more about that in the months and indeed years ahead. It already feels more like a regime than a government to me, appallingly authoritarian. Now, you mentioned this speech that Sir Keir made in the Downing Street Rose Garden. earlier this week.
Scene, of course, of various political moments over the years. John Major's "back me or sack me."
That's very good, that.
And then Redwood challenged him, and the Sun came up with that brilliant headline. So sorry to mention a competitor newspaper. It's Redwood versus Deadwood. Then you had the David Cameron, Nick Clegg loving, didn't you?
Yes.
Then, of course, you had Dominic Cummings explaining why he had to drive around Barnard Castle to test his eyes. But anyway, I digress. On you go.
Yeah, so the Rose Garden was deliberately chosen to look pious and high-minded compared to Boris Johnson and his lockdown party shenanigans. And Sir Keir, in that dentist drill of a voice, said, "That's what a government of service means." God, he's sanctimonious, Liam. He's absolutely unbearable. Look, it was an awful, tone-deaf speech, as you say, barely 2 months since he took office. Now, this period for a new government, they won a huge number of seats. This is when the country is looking for some hope and even inspiration from their new leader. And I was thinking it's absolutely impossible to imagine Tony Blair, when he was newly elected, giving such a gloomy, finger-wagging, vacuous, threatening, policy-light lecture. Not only are we in deep doo-doo, co-pilot, things can only get shittier.
Crikey.
If there are any, put a tune to that.
You're just giving the lawyers a bit of a quandary there, using that vocabulary, aren't you?
I think that's fair enough.
Yeah, I think that's
fair enough. If aspirational people weren't thinking about emigrating before Keir Starmer's speech, he will have given them the push that they needed. So basically, Liam, Prime Minister was paving the way for tax increases in the October budget. And strangely, I didn't hear him mention what happened to all of Rachel Reeves's fully costed plans that we heard so much about during the election campaign. A lot to unpack, co-pilot, but just a couple of things that struck me. He says he's all about being honest and transparent with the British people. Now, you obviously know the economic picture better than me, but it seemed to me that what the picture he was painting was extremely misleading. We have the fastest growing major economy this year, but our new leader decided to talk the country down, saying that there's no money. So this means painful choices. The painful choices, by the way, that include his government approving the spending of 11 billion quid on public sector pay awards, and Mad Miliband, recently spending over 11 billion quid on overseas climate change aid. So the painful choices that Starmer's talking about means removing the winter fuel payment from 8 million pensioners, and that includes people on just over £12,600 a year. And that's axing the winter fuel payment for some very poor people is to save 1.4 billion quid, whilst, as I say, gifting almost 12 billion of taxpayers' cash to African dictators to upgrade their Mercedes diesel fleet. And before I hand back to you, here's a question for you, Liam. When George Osborne had his period of austerity, it was when the wicked Tories do it, Labour shouted, austerity is a political choice. But when Labour do it, apparently it's the right thing to do. What say you, my co-pilot?
There's lots of complexity here, of course.
Huge,
and it's almost as if the complexity is being lathered on thick in order to try and hoodwink the electorate. Yet again, our leading politicians treating the people as fools. Let's just deal briefly with this black hole claim. As the IFS says, this was obvious to anyone who dared look. That is literally a direct quote. If you look on the IFS website, there's an article by their extremely respected leader, Paul Johnson. That is the headline on his article, right? There are sort of two sides to this story because there hasn't been an official spending review for 3 years for various political, lockdown, neglect-related reasons. But even the most basic modelling of where the public finances are, and be in no doubt the kind of modelling that's being done by bond dealers all over the world as they look at the British economy, wondering whether or not they're going to buy our debt going forward. It was pretty clear where the public finances were going and the amount that was going to be needed. So anyone who could claim to be fully funding and costing their plans, as Labour did ad nauseum before the election, will have done such modelling. So I do think in the disingenuousness stakes, it's Labour who are being more disingenuous about this. And it's not just me that thinks that. I've been contacted by quite a lot of heavy people in financial markets over recent days and since Keir Starmer's speech, including some pretty heavy bond dealers who manage portfolios of triple-digit millions, who are wondering when and how and at what price they will buy government debt going forward. And they are just aghast at this claim that Labour didn't know where the public finances were going. You're right, it's not a bad inheritance that Labour have had from the Tories when it comes to growth, fastest in the G7, albeit pretty anemic compared to the late 90s when Blair came in. That's the story of the Western world since the global financial crisis. Unemployment pretty low, inflation in and around target. The public finances are extremely weak post-COVID. Granted that to Labour, that's absolutely true. But the idea that they didn't understand the creation of this fictitious black hole which the Tories hid, it's just a political parlour game. And you have to worry the impact on the British economy when Labour are making an art form out of slagging off the British economy, saying how bad it all is. I mean, what does that do to inward investment? Again, what does that do to the sentiment of international investors who are going to have to keep on funding all this public spending until they don't? And then you have another massive interest rate spike, which of course will cause chaos across the economy for ordinary people, not least those with mortgages and other personal debt, and indeed businesses, which remain, many of them, very heavily indebted, having managed to cling on during the COVID lockdown. The final thing I'd say for now is Keir Starmer's speech. I listened to the whole speech and I agree with you. The tone of it was astonishingly, almost recklessly downbeat. Again, politicking, managing of expectations, completely trumping the responsibility that a government has to try and put, particularly at a time like this, the country's best foot forward. Not to be naive, not to tell porkies about where the British economy is, but to at least offer a hope and a vision for the future, given that there's an awful lot of things that the UK is getting right at the moment. Thank you very much. But to say that this government's focus is unashamedly on growth and wealth creation, a direct quote, as Keir Starmer did, and then to bring in, as is now almost inevitable, a raft of tax rises, I just don't know how that adds up. I just don't, however much you twist logic, however much you ignore economic history, however much you deny the financial and economic and mathematical realities of the world, I don't understand, Allison, how raising taxes a lot when the tax burden is already at a 70-year high, I don't get how that leads to growth. And I wish somebody who gets to hold Starmer to account directly on our airwaves would put that to him and to Rachel Reeves repeatedly. How do higher taxes from already a very, very high position create growth? Because in the end, it's not higher taxes that will fix the public finances. It's not performative spending cuts that will fix the public finances. It is growth that will fix the public finances. The debt that we have, growth creates more revenue, tax revenue by definition. Growth creates lower unemployment benefit and all other benefits by definition. Growth is the way to fix the public finances. To raise taxes to fix the public finances is economically inept.
I think that that's all right. And I think that there's a sort of sense that if they create something called the National Wealth Fund, I'm going to have one of it. I'm going to make one of those. I'm going to open the account in the Abbey National called the National Wealth Fund, and I'm going to wait for taxpayers to put money into it. I mean, it's absolutely laughable, isn't it? Because we know that Norway has got this fabulous sort of sovereign wealth fund, haven't they? Which is all the revenue that Norway's stashed away from the North Sea oil and gas fields. Our North Sea oil and gas fields, of course, Ed Miliband doesn't want us to exploit. So the National Wealth Fund is going to just have about 50p in it. You know, Liam, a bigger problem that occurred to me looking at the Starmer speech. He spoke about the rot in society, this unhealthy country. He was dripping with distaste for Britain. He doesn't like us very much. He really doesn't like us very much. He likes his tribe. It's a very, very tribal speech. And he also spoke about mindless thugs. He said that any talk of legitimate protest during those riots was a pretense. Now, let me just read you these stats.
Sorry. Is this the first Velma moment of the new season?
Oh, yes, go on.
Now, look, Planet Normal listeners are split on this. Some people say, why does that Irish idiot keep making Scooby-Doo noises? But others say, bring back Scooby, bring back Scooby. So on balance, Scooby it is.
Velma facts. 320 arrests, 8 stabbings, 3 people in life-threatening condition in hospital, including a young mother, 35 police injured, 67 knife arrests, 12 sexual assaults, 94 drug offences, 47 emergency workers attacked. And that, Liam, is the Notting Hill Carnival. Now, if that was a gathering on St. George's Day, with what our Prime Minister calls the far right, involving that level of carnage and disruption, you can imagine the crackdown, can't you, that would happen. Nothing of the sort has happened, as far as I know, or very little so far has happened during the Notting Hill Carnival. And this is why the Prime Minister's already earned the label two-tier Keir. And I think this is going to be a real problem because I have not heard him since he became Prime Minister say anything that shows he can unify the nation. So I would say that after those heinous attacks on those little girls in Southport, he needed to say absolutely anybody involved in mindless thuggery, threatening the police, threatening mosques, threatening centres where asylum seekers are living. That was absolutely right. But what we saw was the most extraordinary draconian crackdown, even involving tweets or posts on social media, just absolutely remarkable punishment inflicted on people for what I would say was remarkably little, and certainly compared to some of the things that we've seen elsewhere. So we're seeing a leader, I think, who is not capable of unifying the country. And I think the difficulty that Keir Starmer has going forward, we've talked about this on Planet Normal before, is that although they won a huge number of seats, their majority, as it were, the number of people who voted for Labour, I'm not talking about the number of people who voted against the Conservatives, which seems to have been a huge motive factor. So this Labour government doesn't have deep-rooted support. It has a lot of MPs and not many people who voted for it. And their support, I really will predict now, is likely to evaporate with the slightest setback because very few British people are truly committed to Labour in the first place.
Indeed, that's the electoral fine print I referred to at the top, Allison, and which you and I have been pointing out in our writing and indeed on the Rocket since the election. If you look at the popular vote, like the number of people who actually voted for Labour, Keir Starmer got fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn did in 2019 and in 2017. That's the reality. Labour won 32% of the vote, or just under 33% of the votes, amidst a very, very low turnout because so many people, I'm sick of all of them, stayed at home, not least Conservatives, but others too. So the turnout was historically low 60%. The low, only in 2001 in recent times have we had a turnout that low. And of course, in 2001, Blair was obviously going to win. So not many people turned out. But 32, 33% of 60% when I was at school is 20%. So 1 in 5 of the electorate voted for Labour, which means 4 out of 5 of the electorate didn't vote for Labour. And that's why when they claim they've got this soaring mandate to do all these things that they're going to do, they haven't got a soaring mandate at all. And they should be mindful of that. Just on the riots, of course, I know you think this because you and I have discussed it. There were a lot of people who just wanted to cause a row after the ghastly killing of those 3 precious little girls in Southport. Of course, the rent-a-mob crowd came out, and they always will. But so many people who came out to protest after that were people in pushchairs, families worried about their communities, local people trying to say to the government, look, you really need to listen to us. We've traditionally had immigration into our community and it's worked pretty well. But at the current pace, it is just tearing the social fabric too much when we are all competing for social housing. We're all competing for state help with our health and our education and all the rest of it. And to just dismiss all these concerns when proud local communities actually came together across ethnic divides to try and rebuild their communities, to rebuild walls, to clear up the streets and so on, has mortified many local communities in places like Southport, Liverpool, in Bristol, Nottingham, wherever the riots were. It was the story was so much bigger than just the rent-a-mob crowd who came out, and they did come out. But you can't just dismiss the whole thing as just a bunch of right-wing thugs. And you can't dismiss the whole thing on social media, blaming it all on social media, which then allows the government to bring in a massive clampdown now in the offing, where people are going to be harangued for declaring on social media that they oppose basic principles of the establishment. And that's the essence of journalism. That's the essence of a free society.
But they don't want the free society. They don't want people free to comment. And the reason they don't, Liam, is becoming increasingly apparent across Europe, where multiculturalism is starting to unravel at a very frightening pace. We just saw stabbings in Solingen in Germany. And shortly before that, we had the cancellation of a Taylor Swift concert in Austria because of a very viable terrorist threat. And I think what the political class of whichever government is in, they're in denial now, and they know that things are going badly wrong. And the only way that they have no plan for getting out of it, they have no plan for solving it. So what they're actually doing is just basically punishing anybody who dares to raise the topic of uncontrolled immigration, and indeed of people in our country and other countries living side by side with people who don't share the same civilizational values. And this is a running sore now. And listeners may have heard a fantastic man, John Hayes, who was a lawyer working in the building above the hall where Bibi, Elsie and Alice were killed on a day when they went to have a lovely dance class, Taylor Swift dance class, little girls dancing, singing, enjoying the Western freedoms that are open to all little girls of all ethnicities and religion in our country if the men allow them to enjoy those freedoms. And John Hayes said, look, he thought it was wrong that Keir Starmer had dismissed any talk about wider motivations. And he said there was huge unease about immigration and the pace of immigration. And he felt there should be a national conversation, but Keir Starmer prefers to shut it down. I just want to mention, Liam, one of the stories that's really upset me this week, listeners may have seen it, and this is the increasingly two-tier justice system that many of us are concerned about. A chap called Mohammed Hassan, age 26. This was a court case this week. He berated 3 women at a petrol station in Bradford. He called them slags and prostitutes for not wearing traditional modest Asian dress and putting on makeup. He violently attacked them, grabbing the female driver, slamming her head on the dashboard. He then grabbed another woman's hair and punched her in the face before hitting the third woman. And Mr. Kokar for the prosecution said, in broad daylight, Hassan has attacked 3 females he knew. The offence appears to be motivated by sexist attitudes towards women. Who would have guessed that, Liam? Now, this man, misogynist pig, I would say, was sentenced to 6 months in prison, suspended for 2 years. No jail time at all for a totally horrifying attack on 3 vulnerable women enjoying their lives in a free country. And we don't have to struggle, Liam, to think what would have happened if a 26-year-old white lad had assaulted 3 Muslim women at a petrol station. Quite rightly, he would have been given an extremely harsh punishment, not what happened in this case, which was 35 rehabilitation activities, an electronic tag, and 180 hours of unpaid work. And this, Liam, is what's going on. This is what is fueling so much anger and fear, is that people who don't share our values are being treated lightly by the law, where people from other groups, from white working class people, are bundled unceremoniously into courts with the approval of the Prime Minister, because we can punish those people for trying to talk about fears they have about their country. And can I just end by saying that I read something this morning which said that 4% of the British population arrived in this country in the last 2 years. Tell me that's not going to end badly.
This week's Planet Normal's stowaway is the Spectator columnist Toby Young. But Toby's more than just a columnist, of course, having been at the vanguard of the so-called free schools movement, which inspired Michael Gove's education reforms, creating a string of highly successful state schools enjoying a greater deal of autonomy from local authorities. Toby has also set up the Free Speech Union, giving legal guidance and support to a great many people who have been cancelled for expressing their often not particularly controversial and sometimes entirely mainstream views. The son of the pioneering academic and Labour peer Michael Young, who coined the word meritocracy, Toby is himself an intellectual entrepreneur, having co-founded and co-edited the Modern Review with Julie Burchill, acted in a one-man West End show which he wrote about his time working for Vanity Fair, called How to Lose Friends and Alienate People. And Toby has, over many years, set up a string of influential media platforms, the latest of which is the website The Daily Skeptic, which began during lockdown, which Toby was among the first openly to question and oppose. I started by asking Toby Young why he set up the Free Speech Union in early 2020.
I guess the wellspring was getting cancelled myself in 2018. I was appointed to this new higher education regulator called the Office for Students, which had just been set up by Theresa May. It was announced for some ridiculous reason at 1 minute after midnight on New Year's Day in 2018, and The Guardian got it into its head that the Conservatives were trying to slip this bad news under the radar, and they weren't going to let them get away with that. So the headline on The Guardian's website, front page, a minute after midnight on January 1st, 2018, was Toby Young to be Theresa May's new university czar, which was nonsense. I was one of 15 non-executive directors, so vastly exaggerated what my role was going to be. But anyway, that was like a starting signal for the offence archaeologists to start their engines. Within minutes, they started digging up stuff I'd said dating back 30 years to demonstrate that I wasn't a suitable person to perform this new august role. I mean, they literally went through everything I'd said or written, dating back, I think, to 1987, looking for things to be outraged and offended by. And initially, I just treated it as a bit of a joke, but then it gradually gathered momentum. It was a slow news week. I had a pack of journalists on my doorstep on resignation watch. And I stepped down after a week of this. I very unwisely apologised for some of the more sophomoric things I'd said late at night on Twitter after a couple of glasses of wine. And actually that was like, instead of drawing a line under the whole affair, that was like throwing, a hunk of raw meat to a shoal of piranha fish. Suddenly there was blood in the water. The same outrage mob came for me in 4 other positions. I ended up having to step down from 5 positions in total, including my day job. I was well and truly cancelled. I wasn't quite patient zero in cancel culture, but it was sort of in the foothills of cancel culture, and I was just well and truly bollocksed. And when I'd recovered from this, I thought, well, what I really needed when I was sort of at the eye of this Twitter storm was an organisation that could have given me some decent advice. Should I lie doggo in the hope that less said soonest mended, or should I get out there on the airwaves and defend myself? Would it make things better to apologise, or will it make things worse? Is there anyone else who's been through something like this you can put me in touch with for a bit of, moral support? But there was no organisation like that. Cancel culture was still too young for that kind of service to exist. And I thought, well, I'll start an organisation like that. And that was really the kind of origin of the Free Speech Union. So set it up in February 2020. It was just a couple of us back then. And now we have 23 members of staff. We've actually taken on 2,700 cases. Where there's been a conclusion to a case, we've been successful about 75% of the time. Basically, the organisation it's like a membership organisation. And if you're a member and you get into trouble for exercising your right to lawful free speech, whether in the workplace, at university, on social media, we'll come to your rescue if we can. We've got more than 18,000 members now, Liam. It went completely ballistic, as you might imagine, since Labour won the election and made their intentions about free speech clear, and particularly since people started arrested for things they'd said on social media about the recent disturbances. So in 1 hour, week before last, more people joined than in the whole of June. And we've grown by about 4,000 members this month alone. But, we've been desperately kind of trying to keep up with everything this government is doing to attack free speech. So we've been incredibly busy.
The former Conservative government wanted you to be Education Czar because it wasn't just, get one of their mates in. You had proved yourself for all the unsavoury things that you might have said back in your younger days in jest when hardly anyone was on Twitter. You'd set up the free schools movement, hadn't you? You'd made quite a big contribution, as it happens, to the structure of education in this country. You were at the vanguard of changes which have actually turned out to be pretty successful.
Just to be clear, I wasn't Theresa May's university czar. That was the spin.
That was in quotations.
Yes, so I was an early pioneer in the free schools movement. I co-founded one of the first free schools, which opened in 2011. So free schools enjoy a bit more independence than typical taxpayer-funded schools. They're not controlled by local authorities. They still have to abide by all the admissions rules, so they can't select on the basis of, intelligence or anything like that.
So the very successful Michaela School in northwest London is a free school.
That's right, yeah.
And it's just had incredible results. I think 50% of all their GCSE results are A or A star, 8 or 9.
This year, the West London Free School was just over 50% for the first time. But Michaela have just, their results this year were absolutely extraordinary, particularly given that they're in one of the most deprived parts of London. I think something like 86% of the GCSE students at Michaela got 7, 8 or 9, which is the equivalent of AA star in old money. So yeah, absolutely extraordinary. And free schools generally have been very successful. I think it was one of the Conservatives' few really successful public service reforms, over the last 14 years. For some reason, they haven't been shouting about it from the rooftops. Free schools program, in spite of its success, was really allowed to kind of wither and die. But that wasn't the only part of their kind of education reform package that was successful, but it was probably the most successful part. And it was great to be part of that. I subsequently helped to set up 3 more free schools. All 4 of those schools are now incredibly successful. And I also co-founded a multi-academy trust. There are now 10 schools in the multi-academy trust. I think it must be one of the most successful multi-academy trusts in the country. I think our secondary, its A-level results and GCSE results this year were the best results we've ever achieved. And I think the GCSE results put us in the top 2% of non-selective comprehensive schools in the country. I don't know why the Labour Party want to dismantle the Conservatives' education reforms, given that it was one of the few things the Tories did, which is, just an unqualified success. But one of the things that Bridget Phillipson, the new Education Secretary, is doing, Liam, she's commissioned this intersectional feminist called Becky Francis, a professor of education, to rewrite the national curriculum. So it's going to be made even more woke, if that's possible, and then force free schools and academies to teach it. One of the freedoms that free schools enjoy is that they don't have to teach the national curriculum. At the Multi-Academy Trust I set up, we've been developing our own curriculum materials now for 13 years, and we actually share those materials with hundreds of other schools. They're what are responsible for the great results we get. That's why Michaela is so successful. It's developed its own curriculum materials to, knowledge-rich, traditional, teacher-led, subject-based education, the kind of stuff you typically get at a really good private school, an old-fashioned grammar school. Those are the curriculums that are proving really successful in free schools up and down the country. We don't want to teach the national curriculum, let alone a dumbed-down new Why You Should Vote Labour national curriculum. And yet this government is going to force free schools and academies to do that when they've finished rewriting the curriculum. So that's a fight we're facing coming up in the near future.
Okay, on to your latest news, Toby. The Free Speech Union is bringing a judicial review against Bridget Phillipson, Education Secretary, because she does want to stymie the existing Tory legislation brought in last year, the Freedom of Speech Higher Education Act, to defend free speech at universities. Why are you so vehemently opposed to that?
One of the things I hoped the Free Speech Union would do when I set it up in 2020 was try and strip away all the restrictions that have been imposed on free speech, primarily by the last few governments. But actually turned out that was incredibly politically ambitious, and all we've really been able to do for the most part is stop things getting worse rather than make them any better legislatively, with one major exception, which was the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. We lobbied for that. We helped get it through Parliament. We were involved in drafting the initial legislation. And it was going to put in place slightly more robust protections for academic freedom and free speech on English university campuses and create a couple of enforcement mechanisms. So, since 1986, British universities have had an obligation to uphold and promote free speech on campus, but that's a rule more honoured in the breach than the observance, because to actually hold universities' feet to the fire and make sure they discharge those duties has proved to be incredibly hard. You can only do it via judicial review or by taking the university to an employment tribunal, all expensive, cumbersome, time-consuming. Very few people have the resources to do that. But the great thing about this new act wasn't so much that it improved the protections and made the legal duties slightly more onerous. The great thing about it was it created these two enforcement mechanisms. So if you think your speech rights have been breached by an English university, had the act been put in place, you could complain to the Office for Students. They've promoted this new free speech czar, Arif Ahmed. He would take your complaint, and if he upheld your complaint, he could fine a university for breaching its free speech duties. In addition, if that didn't work, there was the possibility of suing a university in the county court via a new statutory tort created by the Act. So Bridget Phillipson has stopped most of the really important clauses in the Act from being commenced. She's described this as pausing the Act, but we think what it really is.
So it's on the statute book, but she's just stopping it.
Yeah, so it was passed by both houses of Parliament.
Unilaterally, without any reference to Parliament.
That's right. We think she's acted unlawfully. We think she's acted ultra vires, and so the Free Speech Union has threatened to bring a judicial review if she doesn't reverse that decision. They're not going to reverse that decision, so we're now proceeding with this legal case. The problem with bringing judicial reviews, Liam, is it's incredibly expensive. We think we've got a decent chance of prevailing. We really do think she's acted unlawfully. We've got a top team of lawyers on this, but if anyone can help us mount this legal challenge, I think it's really important to let the government know they can't just ride roughshod over free speech without somebody at least fighting back and doing their best to defend these, this vital human right. So if anyone wants to help us pursue this particular legal case, we've got this crowdfund we've set up on Crowd Justice. All the money goes straight to the solicitors. It doesn't come to us. But if they want to donate, just Google Crowd Justice, Free Speech Union, Bridget Phillipson, you'll find it, or go to our website and you'll find it. But any contribution is incredibly helpful because, it could cost as much much as £250,000. So we need all the help we can get. We think it's just really important to let the government know that somebody is going to do their best to fight back if they just start eroding our free speech rights, which is what they seem to be doing.
Toby, when you and I were at university, we will both remember hearing many points of view that shocked us, with which we vehemently disagreed, that we had no idea even existed. And that was just fine. And I'm sure many Planet Normal listeners would say the same. If they went to university during the 70s, 80s and 90s, what's the state of play now when it comes to free speech at British universities? Just give people who haven't been following the debate closely a potted history of the, in my view, crazy things that happen when it comes to free speech at some of our leading universities.
Well, I mean, where to start? About 20% of all the cases the Free Speech Union has taken on in the last almost 5 years now have been either students or academics at universities who've got into trouble just for exercising their right to lawful free speech. We went to bat for Tim Luckhurst, a professor at Durham, who got into trouble, was placed under investigation because he committed the sin of inviting Rod Liddell to come and speak to his students at a dinner.
Probably the Spectator's most popular columnist.
Yeah, former editor of the Today programme.
With apologies to other Spectator columnists who may be on this interview.
I'm happy to admit he's more famous than me. But the students at Durham said that they felt unsafe that someone with his contentious views had been invited into their home, as in, to their university to speak to them. But there is this kind of culture of safetyism now at universities whereby, students think that they don't have to hear views which make them uncomfortable, which challenge them. They prefer to be in a safe space. And if someone like Rod is going to appear and they'd prefer he didn't, then, there need to be trigger warnings and there need to be, psychotherapists standing in the wings ready to help them if they get traumatized or triggered by something Rod has said. I mean, it sounds like a kind of satire, that Kingsley Amis might have dreamt up, but that is the reality of British universities. A lot of the kind of arguments against the Freedom of Speech Act were, this is an imaginary crisis invented by Telegraph journalists. It's just a right-wing culture war trope. There is no free speech crisis in our universities. But the evidence, Liam, that there really is absolutely overwhelming. One of my favourite bits of evidence, which I came across recently, is that there's something called the Academic Freedom Index, a global index which ranks 179 countries according to how much academic freedom there is in those countries. And the UK, in the most recent Academic Freedom Index, was ranked 66th in the world, below Peru, Georgia, and Burkina Faso, lowest in the European Union. And, all surveys of academics and students, they constantly say, a majority constantly say, they no longer feel free to speak their minds for fear of social censure.
It's not just punchy journalists. You and I would agree, and would agree if Rob was in the room. He can be deliberately provocative. That's his job. He's a columnist. But even someone like Kathleen Stock, an incredibly distinguished academic. Explain briefly to listeners, Toby, how she ended up being cancelled.
Yeah, so Kathleen Stock was a professor of philosophy at the University of Sussex, and she is what's known as a gender-critical feminist. So she believes in the biological reality of sex, and she thinks that trans rights conflict with women's rights in some cases. So in women's sports, for instance, or women's only spaces like shelters. And she's a defender of sex-based women's rights. And that, believe it or not, Liam, is an incredibly controversial position in British universities today.
It reflects the views of an enormous share of the population.
Vast majority of people. Yes. Trans rights has become the kind of civil rights struggle of this generation of students, egged on by their, academics, their lecturers and tutors who were radicalized in the 1960s. And they're incredibly intolerant of anyone who challenges, the trans rights agenda. And Kathleen Stock is one of those people. So she was effectively hounded off campus. She received death threats. There were constant protests on campus about her. When she tried to give lectures, they'd be disrupted. In the end, she had no choice but to leave her job. And not because, she was a Holocaust denier, not because she was a conservative who had, contentious views about mass uncontrolled immigration, but because she expressed what you and I would regard as a completely common sense view about sex and about protecting women's rights, which, as you say, probably 90% of the country agree with. But on British universities, that point of view is now considered beyond the pale. There was one famous stat in a survey carried out by Policy Exchange, which found that I think something like 4 out of 10 academics at British universities said they'd be uncomfortable sitting next to a gender-critical feminist in the university canteen for fear of the damage it would do to their reputations. That's 40% of British academics being unwilling to be seen in public with people who believe in the biological reality of sex and want to defend women's rights. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary.
And just finally, Toby, free speech and these riots that we've seen over the summer. How concerned are you about a clampdown on free speech? How concerned are you that people, ordinary members of the public, retweeting, in some cases, pretty tasteless, pretty stupid things, but they're ending up in jail?
It is, I think, a new departure. I can't think of a time when people have been sent to jail en masse for things they've said on social media. I think it's incredibly alarming and shows just how little regard this government has for free speech. The fact that Keir Starmer has been encouraging the authorities to prosecute people for supposedly, whipping up violence on social media. I think were we in America, almost none of the prosecutions brought against people for things they've said about the recent disturbances on social media, none of them could have been prosecuted because of the First Amendment.
Would you acknowledge that social media played some role in fanning the flames of those riots, the way they spread across the country? Or would you say we had a huge spread of riots in 2011? We had rioting in various parts of the country when we were kids, before social media even existed.
As you say, we've had public disturbances in the past before we've had social media. And typically, those disturbances have often been blamed on other new technologies. So I think the Brixton riots in 2005 were blamed on pirate radio. People tried to blame BlackBerry Messenger for the riots in 2011. It's just a convenient scapegoat. And I think that there probably would have been disturbances following the horrendous attack on a group of schoolgirls in Southport, even if there'd been no comments on social media about it, because it was such a shocking, terrible thing. Even if you acknowledge that social media has played some role, I think it's very difficult to make a causal connection between something somebody tweeted, however unsavory the disturbances. I mean, I think one particular judge in sentencing someone who just said something on social media said that they were part of the spider's web within which these riots occurred. I mean, it was the most kind of tenuous form of reasoning. And don't forget, Liam, it isn't just people who've actually called for violence against Muslims, say, who've been prosecuted and sent to prison. It's people who've retweeted or reposted memes on Facebook. People have been prosecuted for chanting, "Who the F is Allah?" in Downing Street or outside mosques, as though that in itself is a criminal offence. One person was sent down for, among other things, and this was in the BBC report, someone in Nottingham sent down for 3 years because, amongst other things, he'd engaged in what was described as anti-establishment rhetoric. Since when has that been unlawful in this country? So one of the things we've done at the Free Speech Union, Liam, is we've put in place a relationship with a top firm of criminal solicitors. So if any of our members are contacted by the police because of something they've said about the recent disturbances on social media, they can reach out to this particular firm of solicitors. We promise them a free telephone consultation. If we think their case has merit, we will pay for their entire defence. I think one of the reasons we've signed up so many members in the past few weeks is because people are terrified that things they've said on social media, sometimes dating back several years, will be brought up and used against them in a court of law, and they may end up going to prison. Now, for the most part, they're worrying about nothing, and we're able to reassure many of them. But that seems to be partly the intention behind this kind of mass prosecution of people for things they've said on social media. It produces this extraordinarily chilling effect. And I think people are going to be, they'll be thinking twice. They'll be biting their tongues before they criticize the government in future. And that must be part of the government's intention.
Toby Young, great to have you on Planet Normal.
Thanks, Liam.
So there you have it, Allison. Toby Young, creator of The Daily Skeptic and the Free Speech Union.
Liam, I think he's a real hero. And I think Toby has progressed from being seen as a bit of a gadfly to being a really important figure. And I think that founding the Free Speech Union we can't overstate how significant that's going to be for all the reasons we've been talking about in this dealing with a potentially very authoritarian government, quite alarmingly so. And as he told us, he's taken up for numerous highly deserving people challenging this very, very frightening lack of freedom of speech.
Almost 3,000 of them now, as he said.
Yeah.
I mean, I checked the numbers of a while ago and it was 2,300 and he corrected me, didn't he? No, it's nearer 2,800 now. Crikey.
Yeah, well, I think in a time when it's now quite clear that populist is government code for people who disagree with us. And I just want to mention, Liam, there was the Home Office tweeted after the riots, more than 1,000 arrests due to recent public disorder. And it went on to say, these criminals will face the full force of the law. Now, we still have this quaint idea of innocent until proven guilty. And it was extremely disturbing to see our Home Office calling people who hadn't stood trial criminals. And the Free Speech Union immediately challenged that terminology. The reply came back and the Home Office said the tweet was in line with civil service guidance.
That's almost Orwellian language, isn't it?
It's absolutely Orwellian.
It's like when you phone a utility company and they're doing moronic things to you and they're ripping you off and they say, well, these are our rules. Yeah, but your rules are insane. That's my point.
Yes. Well, in this case, not only are your rules, this is not what our system is. Our system is not that you call people who've been arrested criminals. And the Free Speech Union was absolutely right to challenge that. And I would urge Planet Normal listeners to take a look at what they offer. And I've joined and I'm very, very glad to be involved with the FSU. And I see Toby and his organisation forming the sort of backbone of the resistance, which I think we're going to need in the years ahead with the doublespeak. And, above my desk where I'm talking to you now, Liam, I have a quote. The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. George Orwell, thou shouldst be living at this hour.
Now on to our listener emails. Your messages sent to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We learn so much from you, the citizens of Planet Normal.
And we're going to need each other all the more going forward, I think. This is from Jackie. I have listened to Keir Starmer's speech. What a patronising, arrogant, self-serving man he is. I'm realising that when he said the country is rotten to the core, he's actually preparing the ground for his personal vision of the country, and that is a communist dictatorship. Say what you mean, Jackie. Becky says, my son-in-law says his broad shoulders, on which Keir Starmer plans to place further burdens, are already bent double, working long, hard hours, but it merely results in him paying exorbitant tax with no tax allowance for having children. His high tax keeps illegal migrants fed and housed, pays billions towards climate and foreign aid, and grasping trade unions, says Becky. And finally, Robbo, we seem to be living in a case study of why socialism doesn't work. Very painful times ahead. Oh, go on, Robbo. We'll have a laugh about it, won't we?
This is from Dan, a Planet Normal listener who served in Her Majesty's Armed Forces. Thanks for your service, Dan. And Dan has dubbed the current administration the Pearson government. Welcome back for your well-earned break, Liam and Allison. Given recent events, I wouldn't blame you if you did a Boeing on your capsule and stayed on Planet Normal for a few extra months. Barely 2 months into the holier-than-thou Pearson party's rule. Washes whiter. Okay. And the hypocrisy's already beginning to stink to high heaven. Double standards. I'd get locked up if I called it two-tier. In the new administration are rife from tax increases, policing, judicial influence, censorship to plain old-fashioned bullying of any dissenters. Here are a few choice examples, says Dan. Keir Starmer on Twitter, The Labour Party has a fully costed plan to freeze energy bills this winter, but now Rachel Reeves will make sure that only things being frozen will be the pensioners' homes, and the energy price cap is being increased by 10% to a double whammy for the elderly. Quote from our new PM 2 says Dan, "We will restore standards in public life with a total crackdown on cronyism, unless that is you're a Labour peer with an unrestricted pass to number 10 who paid 16 grand for the PM's work clothes, in quotes, and another £24,000 for his accommodation costs, or donors to the Chancellor and other ministers who by chance came out of a non-existent selection process to land senior posts in the civil service." Then we have the almost fascist level of censorship, says Dan, with another dose of two-tier standards, especially if you're, quotes, far right, which by now must cover around 60% of the population, to say nothing of Starmer taking the knee shortly after a dozen police officers were injured during the Black Lives Matter riots in 2020. To the voters who are expecting a Starmer government to be just a slightly deeper shade of pink than Sunak's, suckers! Keep up the fight, gal and crew. Yours, Dan.
Great email, Dan. And this is from Robin. Dear Liam and Allison, good to have you back. Lovely to be back, Robin. For the time being, you and a few other media outlets are just about the only effective opposition to Starmer and his mob. I enjoyed the discussion with Claire Fox, but felt that you failed to join the dots. The so-called riots, they were relatively small and short-lived compared to, say, 2011 or 1981. And were a reflection of the fact that a huge swathe of the population feels completely disenfranchised. They voted for Brexit in 2016 and watched as the establishment tried to reverse the decision. They voted again in 2019 for a centre-right agenda and watched in horror as the Tory party moved decisively to the left and then destroyed itself from within. In the last election, many just didn't bother to vote at all because there was no point. For now, they are restive but simmering. I fully expect more serious public disorder on such a wide scale that Starmer will not be able to dismiss it as far right or hope to crush by locking up a few old ladies for reposting critical Twitter memes. I hope I'm wrong, says Robin, but I can't see any other outcome.
And finally, Allison, this is from Mike. Dear Allison and Liam, this one is for Velma, says Mike, with her expertise on economics. And Allison has edited into the script here, blooming cheek. Maybe he's not being sarcastic. Maybe he's actually paying you a compliment.
Yeah, I exist to be the butt of jokes about my economic expertise, Halligan. I know my place.
However, not being a member of the expert class and just an avid listener of the podcast, says Mike, and a humble entrepreneur and businessman, I thought I'd share my economic forecast. Watch unemployment and the economically inactive, the new term for unemployment by those feigning an issue and claiming an extra benefit, according to Mike. Watch it go out of control over the next 2 years. Just like inflation, this is not expected by the establishment and politicians, but it's starting to happen as a result of their policies of increasing the minimum wage far too fast, 20% in the last 2 years and probably another 10% plus next year, and turning employees into a liability for employers rather than an asset, with them now having full employment rights from day one of employment. And the young will suffer the most. With plenty to choose from, what employer is going to recruit an inexperienced and hormonally distracted 18-year-old over an older worker when the new Labour law says they must be paid the same? Like my business, says Mike, which next year will have reduced headcount from 180 to 110 over 2 years with no loss of sales, my bank area director tells me that the current theme he sees with all his clients of every size and market is the move to reduce headcount by every means they can. I also hear the same message at our local Chamber of Commerce meetings. The establishment think they've cracked unemployment, and so they have and are still importing hundreds of thousands of immigrants to do the work. But in my view, they have a big shock in store created by their own naivety. Kind regards, Mike. And I have to say, Allison, in my long experience of trying to say things about the economy that come true, you don't learn anything staring at spreadsheets and talking to politicians and civil servants, which is what the vast majority of economic commentators do. You learn things by getting out there and talking to people who run businesses, particularly small businesses. That's the background I come from. That's why I've always done that throughout my journalistic career. I just wish ministers were from small business and business backgrounds. And yet I look across the shadow cabinet and I see none. And on that bombshell, that's it from Planet Normal for another week as we leave our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reason's views. email of the week, it's the new girl, Allison.
Well, I'm in your spirit, Liam. I'm going to award it to Mike, a small businessman, obviously very successful, just reporting to us from the front line and telling us the truth, as you say, that the economics establishment often misses. Mike, please do email us, send us your full details and your address. And a fabulous, rare as rocking horse poo Planet Normal mug will be winging its way to you.
And as we speed away from our beloved Planet Normal and the madness of Planet Earth comes back into view, thanks as ever to our producers Isabel Bouchard, Cass Ho and Louise Wells. And can I just say thank you to our producers. Now we're back from school properly for putting together those summer break episodes of the best of. It's a lot of work, and many listeners have emailed us to say how grateful they were for them. Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.